What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Duke Wisdom Podcast. There's just one topic for today's discussion, and it is breaking down my top 25 players of the 2010s article that came out yesterday. So I want to break down each of my picks, kind of go through those and explain why I picked, who I picked, where, that kind of thing. Now, I'm recording this on Tuesday, actually. So if there's anything that's happened in the world of Duke basketball in the last 2 days, I'll probably tweet about it and then talk about it on the pod next week. I kind of doubt that'll be the case given we're in June, but who knows? You never know, right? This is a list. This top 25 players of the 2010s is a list that I've wanted to do for a while since I really revamped the Duke Wisdom website back in 2022. This is an article that I've had kind of in the drafts. I've now changed the graphics for it and exactly the way I would have wanted to go about it. I've changed the rankings around a little bit. I actually had a little notebook that I had at work while I was working as an accounting assistant. I had a little notebook that I was just like during the day, I was writing these rankings down on. And so I had a picture of that notebook page with my top 25. And there's a few places where I tweaked the rankings since then. And I'll kind of dive into that when I come across places like that. But this is something that has genuinely been in the works. Not like I've been working on it for years, but it's an idea that has sat in the drafts for years and has just now finally come to fruition. And I'm glad that it's come to fruition. This is something I'm really excited about. I'm also going to be releasing a top, I think 15, but maybe 20 players of the 2000s, then a top 15 players of the 90s, top 15 of the 80s, probably a top 10 of the 70s, top 10 of the 60s, and then top 10 of the 50s and before. And all of this on all of these articles and these podcast breakdowns will culminate in a top 100 Duke basketball players of all time list that will be dropping, I don't know, at some point later, much later in the summer. My life's constantly evolving and changing right now. I'm at a point in my life as a recent college graduate where that's going to happen. And so who knows what job I'm going to land or where I'm going to be going at a point later in the summer. Who knows? So we'll see about that. That will certainly impact my ability to be as regular with these lists as I would like. Right now, my goal is to put out one of these decade lists a week, which would mean this one came out this week. We get the 2000s list around the 12th, the 90s around the 19th of June. We're looking at the beginning of July being the 70s list, and then probably it would be more like toward the beginning of August-ish for the top 100. But at some point in August is my goal to have that top 100 list. I'm putting that on your radar now. It's something I'm super excited to put together, and I hope that you guys would be excited to read that. Obviously, it'll follow a little bit of the lines of the decade list. I'm not gonna break from that. So if I ranked a player where if there are two players in the 2010s and I ranked a guy above another guy now, I'm probably not gonna go back on that. There's a possibility, but I'm gonna try not to go back on my word, and I'm gonna keep them kind of aligned where I had them on the decades rankings. Anyway, so that's sort of my preview into this. So let's jump into it with the other honorable mentions. I have a top honorable mention for every decade.
Want to join a community of Duke accounts publishing news, theories, and predictions on Duke athletics? Join the Duke Wisdom Network. Just go to dukewisdom.org/join network today and fill out the form with your name and social media. Or you can DM at Duke_Wisdom on Twitter or Instagram. Become a part of the community of Duke fans publishing their takes today. Again, that's dukewisdom.org/join network or DM at Duke_Wisdom on Twitter or Instagram.
But my other honorable mentions for the 2010s were, let's start from the guy who probably got the least consideration up to the top. We'll start with Trayvon Duval, who averaged like 10 points a game as a freshman starting point guard. He just never lived up quite to the hype. He wasn't as efficient as we would have liked. He was a very good player, though. And then also we're looking at Miles Plumlee and Marshall Plumlee, two players who were very good, played good roles, played in the NBA, just never pushed double-digit scoring, were never quite good enough to make it onto this list. And then probably the best of these guys is Frank Jackson, who had a really effective freshman year. I mean, was scoring 20 points in games pretty consistently by the end of his single year at Duke. A guy that I think would have benefited and certainly made this list with a sophomore season. But I've got Jackson there. With that out of the way, let's dive into the top honorable mention. My top honorable mention is Kyrie Irving. Now, Kyrie being the top honorable mention, some people will be like, how is Kyrie not on this list? Kyrie averaged 17 points a game. How is he not on this list? He's probably, if he isn't the most talented player to ever play at Duke, he's one of. How is he not on this list? He was potentially the team's best player before getting injured. How is he not on this list? He played 11 games. That's the only explanation I need to give, I think. Because when you look at the accomplishments, the career statistics, the longevity and of some of the players I have, especially at the bottom of this list, but throughout this list, I could not possibly bring myself to put a player who only played 11 games on it. I couldn't. And Kyrie is 100% one of the top 25 best players, if I'm just saying skill-wise. But this list, and this is how I kind of introduced the list, it cannot take NBA performance into account whatsoever. That is one of the silver linings of this list. No NBA performance is taken into account whatsoever. And then it is sort of a balancing act of how good a player was as a one and done, just as a player, and then their accolades. But accolades as a one and done matter as well, not just career accolades. You have players at the end of this list, at the top of this list, who have ridiculous amounts of career accolades because they played 4 years and were very decorated players for 4 years. And you have players who played for 1 year who had decorated awards, but just for a season. For Kyrie, he played so little that he didn't have anything accolade-wise besides that he made the NCAA tournament all-region team in that single season. That's it. That's all he had. And he played so few games that it was just pretty much impossible for me to put him on this list. You might disagree with that, but for me, Kyrie just didn't play enough. And that's why I can't put him on this list. And so here's another thing that I have to highlight about who can be on this list. So a couple players as examples. Let's think of Trey Jones. Trey Jones did play in 2019. But he also played in 2020. There's a direct even split for Trey Jones between the 2010s and the 2020s. But because his most successful 50% happened in the 20s, Trey Jones was on my 2020s list. Similarly, there's an even split for Nolan Smith and Kyle Singler, who both played 08 to 2011. 2 years in the 2000s, 2 years in the 2010s. Their most successful years, their 50% of most success, happened in the 2010s. Both of those players will be on this list. John Shire, however, played in 2010, had his most successful year in 2010, but that was only 1 year. He played 3 years in the 2000s. Because the majority of his career happened in the 2000s, John Shire will not appear on this list. He will be on the 2000s list. I hope that makes sense. So if you're thinking, where's John Shire? He won't be on this list. If you're thinking, where's Trey Jones? Not on this list. Kyle and Nolan will be. And if you were thinking, where are they on the 2000s list next week or whatever, whenever that drops, they're not going to be on that. So anyway, hopefully I can clear that up. So Kyrie was my top honorable mention. At 25, I've got Andre Dawkins. Andre Dawkins is a 1,000 point scorer. There's not that many players on this list that are 1,000 point scorers. Actually, I think Dawkins is like one of 8, maybe. And so that's a pretty big deal. He's top 10 all time in three-pointers made as well. Obviously a national champion who went to the Final Four, a 2-time tournament champion, and an ACC regular season champion. He wasn't a starter for any of those championship teams, but he certainly played a role in them. A terrific three-point shooter. For me, Andre Dawkins landed at 25. I had a tough decision between him and the guy I went with at 24. The guy I went with at 24 was Matt Jones. The reason I picked Matt Jones above Andre Dawkins, he scored less career points than Dawkins, and he hit less career three-pointers than Dawkins as well. So not a 1,000-point scorer was Matt Jones. However, Matt Jones was a 3-year starter, And he was a starter during the NCAA tournament during Duke's national title run in 15. That's something he has that Dawkins doesn't. He was also an ACC all-defense selection his senior season. So that defense was something he had on Dawkins as well. So while he lacked a little bit in scoring, he also had a double-digit point per game season as a junior. That's something Dawkins never did either, although Dawkins was very much on the cusp of that during his graduate season in 2014. But for me, Matt Jones just barely edged out Dawkins for the number 24 slot. And I talked about on that little piece of notebook paper when I wrote out the rankings that I changed a few things. This is one of those things. I had Jones 25 originally, Dawkins at 24. I convinced myself to swap them. Getting out of two graduates, here's where we get into a little bit of testy waters. And this is the biggest debate of this list is how do I value one and done seasons versus careers? And so at 23, I have Cam Reddish. For me, obviously, Cam Reddish doesn't have a 1,000-point season. He doesn't have the ACC all defense. He wasn't a starter on a national championship team. He doesn't have the trophies on trophies. He has one ACC tournament championship, and he averaged about 13, 14 points a game during 1 year. And how do I weigh that is the question. But to me, Cam Reddish was just he played a full season. He didn't really deal with injuries much, and at least not that made him miss games. He was dealing with some injuries throughout the year, though. He did miss a few games, though, especially there in the NCAA tournament. But for me, Reddish was just better than Matt Jones and Andre Dawkins. I don't have much better way to explain that other than Cam Reddish was just better in that one season. And does that mean that I can weigh him over 4 years of being good but not a better player necessarily? I don't know. That was the tough decision to make, but I went Reddish at 23, and that was just that's sort of an example of the way I'm weighing things. That if a player that only played 1 year, I thought he was just better, he kind of ended up getting higher on this list, and that's how I felt about Cam Reddish in relation to Matt Jones and Andre Dawkins. So I went Reddish at 23, and at 22, I went with another one and done. I went with Gary Trent Jr., who just barely ends up on this list over Reddish. He averaged more points, has very little, had no team accomplishments in terms of championship winning, although that team went to the Elite Eight just like the 2019 team did, just didn't win the ACC tournament. He was NCAA tournament all-region. That's his really only individual accolade. But Trent, for me, is one of those underrated players, one of the most underrated one-and-dones Duke's ever had. I think he ended that year the second highest scorer on that Duke team, and he did not receive a single All-ACC vote. He wasn't even on the All-Freshman team, which I think is ludicrous, by the way. Gary Trent Jr., one of the most underrated players I think Duke has ever had in a single season. He was terrific, and I think he was better than Cam Reddish. So if it's just he was a better player, obviously than Dawkins and Jones, but he's also just a better player than Reddish. At 21, and I'm not even sure how I really compare Gary Trent to this guy as an individual player. Between Trent and Winslow, I'd have to have some discussions with people about who was genuinely better during their single season at Duke. I would err on the side of Justice Winslow, though, but Justice Winslow is who I had at 21. Obviously, Winslow's team accomplishments helped usher him higher than Trent. A national champion, a starter on that championship team, a very important starter on that championship team. He was all ACC freshman, NCAA all tournament team, NCAA tournament all region as well. And so Winslow, a very good player, averaging about 12.5 points a game for a national title team, earns him here. Here's an interesting discussion. That single season is perhaps better than any single season that the guy at number 20, Ryan Kelly, ever had. I have Ryan Kelly at 20, though. He's a 4-year player. He's also a national champion. He went to the Final Four with two ACC tournament titles and an ACC regular season champion. But for all but that 2011 ACC tournament title, he really played no role in 2010. He averaged like 1 point per game. He didn't do anything in terms of being on the court for winning those championships. Winslow did. And so those team accolades are kind of a moot point. Individual accolades, Ryan Kelly has none. He did have that 36-point game against Miami, though, and that was one of the coolest moments I've ever witnessed as a Duke fan, coming back from that injury and dropping 36. But for Ryan Kelly, for me, it was just playing those 4 years and being a starter in the back half and being a good starter and showing so much improvement, shot blocking. And I think Ryan Kelly was just, his career and what he did in his career, I couldn't, because his senior season was so similar statistically to Winslow's 1 year, that it was like, yeah, his other 3 years are going to push him over Justice, even though he didn't play the role for his championship that Winslow did for his. I think that Ryan Kelly as a career has to be placed over Justice Winslow. And so there's so many weird weights. The 2010s is the hardest decade to do. You'll find in the 2000s and the 90s, and especially in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and as it goes backward, that you don't have to weigh so many early exits versus 4-year players. It's just mostly 4-year players, and I'm kind of weighing career accolades. What accolades are more important? What's, this or that or this or that. But in the 2010s, it's like, we have this 4-year player who is a 2 or 3 year starter, good player, never a great player, but then we have this pretty great but a better player in one season, but just one season. He doesn't have the longevity, but he was better in that year. But like, how do we weigh that? So, and that's also why there's 25 players on this list, and there's not going to be another top 25 list because there's just so many talented one and dones. There's so much more talent in the 2010s than any other decade in Duke basketball history. And I think that is almost an irrefutable fact in terms of quantity. There is so much more talent in that decade than in any other decade ever. And you get the Ryan Kellys, and you get the Justice Winslows, and you get the Andre Dawkins, and you get the Cam Reddish. And so that's how I think this is the most interesting, and it was probably the most difficult list to make, although next week's is going to be hard, especially at the top for the 2000s. And we'll get into that. But number 19, I got Rodney Hood. These next 3 are really difficult. And I'm going to kind of list them all out and then explain, because they're the 3 that were kind of playing off each other. 19, Rodney Hood. 18, Wendell Carter. 17, Emil Jefferson. Again, I actually think I have these guys in reverse order of how good they actually were. Like, Rodney's was probably the best. He probably had the best, or perhaps had the best individual season, but I'm actually going to make the argument that Wendell Carter did. But there's the argument, I mean, in terms of points per game, that Rodney's at the top, then Wendell, then Emil. But here, let me unwrap this. The Rodney Hood Wendell Carter is the one that might be the most controversial. Hood averaged about like 4 more points per game than Wendell Carter. It's really the secondary statistics of averaging a double-double for Wendell Carter. I'm not going to sit here and make the argument that Wendell Carter's numbers were lower because he played next to Marvin Bagley, because then there's the argument that's like, well, Rodney Hood played next to Jabari Parker, so who cares? So here's the real argument. Wendell played on a better team. Wendell Carter was a really high-level defender and shot blocker, and his rebounding. And then there's just basically one season of comparison. There definitively is one season of comparison between Hood and Carter, and I got Wendell Carter by the skin of his teeth over Rodney Hood. The reason I have Emil Jefferson over both of these guys, again, not because he was necessarily a better player, but Emil Jefferson was a starter at some point for 5 years. Not a full-time starter in his freshman season, but he definitively was for most of the back 4, although he only played 10 games in 2016 before getting injured. Emil Jefferson has played in more games than any Duke basketball player ever. He's first all-time. He's top 10 all-time, I think, in rebounding. And he's also a 1,000-point scorer, which I mentioned earlier on in the discussion of Andre Dawkins, how few players there are that have scored over 1,000. Emil Jefferson is one of those guys. Now, the games played thing, he had a kind of unusual benefit of playing a 5th year before that was a thing with COVID. But Emil Jefferson, he just had the career statistics. He was a starter for most of the year for the 2015 national championship team, and that's why it's just career accolades pushed Emil over the other 2 guys. I think the Carter Hood one is more of the debate. Beyond that, let's keep moving on to number 16, which is Austin Rivers. I think there's a pretty big jump from Emil Jefferson to Austin Rivers in terms of quality. When Rivers, you're talking about a guy who got a couple All-American nods. Now, in the article, you'll notice that there was some players that have All-American nods, but they weren't consensus. I didn't list it as an accolade unless they were a consensus All-American. You can't be a consensus third-team All-American. You can only be consensus first or second. Rivers had third-team nods. He was not a consensus All-American. That's a similar scenario to Quinn Cook and Seth Curry, who I don't have All-American status listed for. either. So Austin Rivers at 16. He was first team All ACC, ACC Freshman of the Year. Hit at that dagger of a shot in the Dean Dome. I think kind of the guy he was in competition with is the guy I have at 15, which is Tyus Jones. Received some feedback that Tyus Jones should maybe be higher. I did a one and done bracket years ago in which Tyus Jones almost won somehow. Love Tyus to death. I think that his role in the NCAA tournament has made some Duke fans adopt some questionable opinions on Jones's season. He was fantastic, but at the end of the day, he was a third-team All-ACC selection who averaged 11 points a game. He was remarkable, and he was a Final Four most outstanding player, something only 5 Duke players can say. But Jones, again, was only the third best player on that team, and Austin Rivers was the best player on his team. He was the Freshman of the Year on his team. So it was up in the air, ultimately because of the team accolades and the role he played for the national title. I gave Tyus Jones the edge over Austin Rivers, who was a 15-point per game scorer. However, I could not give Tyus Jones the edge over Brandon Ingram, who I have at 14, and Jason Tatum, who I have at 13. Some people are going to argue with me that he should be over those guys. Ingram was an ACC Freshman of the Year, and Jason Tatum was not. He was a third-team All-ACC selection like Jones, but I think it was in one of the most loaded years in ACC history in 2017. I also think Tatum would have been ACC Freshman of the Year if it weren't for like a 19-point per game season out of Dennis Smith. I think he maybe still should have been ACC Freshman of the Year over Dennis Smith. But when you look at those two guys, it's like 17 points a game from Brandon Ingram, 17 points per game from Jason Tatum. We're talking about two of the most talented players to ever play at Duke. No, they did not win a national title. No, they were not Final Four most outstanding players. But in terms of who do I think was just a better player, again, and it's only a one-season comparison each time. Obviously, Tyus has the banners. Ingram was just better. I don't know how else to say it. And Tatum was just better. He didn't contribute to more banners. Neither of them did. But they were just better. And I don't know how else to put it. It sounds kind of stupid putting it that way. But that's how I ended up with it. I wouldn't be mad at placing Tyus Jones at 13 and moving that around a little bit. But the way I've got it is Tyus at 15, Ingram at 14, Tatum at 13. Now we move into some 4-year guys. Let's go Seth Curry at 12. Seth Curry has an asterisk next to most of his team accomplishments because most of them happened in 2010, and he did not play. He was a red shirt that year back when he actually had to sit out a year after transferring. But he did play on that 2011 ACC tournament squad. I think he actually got ACC All-Tournament honors there. He was a 2-time All-ACC selection, second team as a senior, third team as a junior. He was on the NCAA All-Tournament region team in 2013, and he scored 1,394 points. That's 37th all-time at Duke. He's, of course, had an 11-year NBA career after being undrafted. That has nothing to do with this list, though. But Seth Curry was just a remarkable shooter, and he ended up having such a remarkable senior year. He played the entire year basically without practicing and playing it on an injury and getting, like I mentioned earlier, some All-American nods. And some people thought he was Duke's best player that season. I think he was second, but he's terrific. He's one of my favorite Blue Devils of all time, and he earns a spot at 12 here. And at 11 for me is a 4-year player who earned his way just above Seth Curry. He scored more career points, 1,571 career points. He's a multiple-time All-ACC selection, sort of a similar second-team and third-team selections like Curry. But he's a national champion and a very important player on that championship team, and that's Quinn Cook. Quinn Cook's who I have at 11. He's 29th all-time in scoring, 7th all-time in assists at Duke, 9th all-time in three-pointers made. Just what a remarkable player is Quinn Cook. Obviously, the points thing, he's working with 4 years to Curry's 3 in a Duke jersey. So Seth would have outscored him in 4-year capacity. Actually, Seth Curry has over 2,000 career points in college. Just I'm not counting the Liberty points toward his totals, but Quinn Cook being the second best player on a national championship team had to catapult him pretty high. It actually hurt me to only put Quinn Cook 11th. When I put him 11th, it kind of felt like, wow, Quinn's only 11th. is the way I was thinking about this, because Quinn Cook's such a just big name for Duke basketball, and in terms of a player staying 4 years and whiffing in the first round as a freshman, and then almost getting the Final Four as a sophomore, but not quite, and then whiffing in the first round as a junior, to being a national champion and being that important on a national championship team is massive. So to think he's only 11th is crazy, but I just don't think there's much case for him over any of the guys in the top 10. And so here is the top 10. 10, Jabari Parker. Whenever you have a guy who is a consensus first-team All-American who covered Sports Illustrated or Slam like 5 or 6 times during his time at Duke in one season, and he was the runner-up for National Player of the Year, and most years would have won National Player of the Year had he not been going against like the 26 or 7 points per game of Doug McDermott that season. Anytime you got that guy and he's 10th on this list, that's how you know you were doing something right during the decade. Jabari could have been higher than this. Jabari Parker is like my favorite Blue Devil of all time. Some people might think that's a weird pick. I loved Jabari Parker. There's recently come out those videos of him breaking down in front of a reporter in Barcelona, and I feel so bad for him the way his NBA career panned out with those injuries. But his time at Duke was fantastic. 19 points a game. I mean, he could have been National Player of the Year. He should have been ACC Player of the Year. He would have been the first freshman to ever do that. The next season, Jaleel Okafor claimed that title. But Parker, just a remarkable season as ACC Freshman of the Year and a first-team All-American, earns him 10th on this list. He had a better individual season than the guy who's ranked right above him, which is Mason Plumlee. That's who I have at 9th. I actually considered Plumlee at 8. I considered all 3 of the next guys at Parker at 10, Mason Plumlee at 9, and then at 8 I have Luke Kennard. And I think I considered all of them, switching them in whatever order. Ultimately, Plumlee, for his career accolades, he wasn't great he plays decent. He's okay as a freshman. He was a little bit better as a sophomore. He was an All-ACC player as a junior, and then he was a second-team consensus All-American National Big Man of the Year. As a senior, he was fantastic. He ended up being 4th all-time at Duke in rebounding, 4th all-time in blocks, and he's 38th in scoring with 1,384 career points. And it's those career numbers and being atop those rebounding and blocks list that made me had to put him over Jabari Parker. I just had to put him over Jabari Parker. For me, it was his longevity that put him over Parker. And honestly, I was about to put him over Luke Kennard, but then I just thought about it. I was like, Kennard was also a consensus second-team All-American. He led Duke to a banner directly. Plumlee had banners, but he wasn't really the lead contributor to those banners. Parker didn't hang any banners. Luke Kennard hung the ACC Tournament Championship banner as the best player and as the tournament MVP. Plus, he had his sophomore year was at least comparable to Mason Plumlee's. I would argue it was probably maybe better than Mason Plumlee's senior season. Again, he was the first player in Duke basketball history to play less than 3 years and join the 1,000-point club. He was fantastic in his 2 seasons, and so for me, I just think he was a better player. Had he played 4 years, he'd be remarkably high on this list. But Luke Kennard, if not first, but Luke Kennard is terrific. I have him at 8. 7 for me is RJ Barrett. People can make arguments for any of like the last 4 guys to be higher than Barrett, but Barrett gets a lot of crap. And he gets overlooked a lot because Zion was on his team. But RJ Barrett had the second highest scoring single season in Duke basketball history behind only JJ Redick's senior season. I mean, RJ was a little over 100 points away from being in the 1,000-point club in a single season. So that's ridiculous from a scoring perspective. In any season in which Zion Williamson does not exist, RJ Barrett was National Player of the Year. I think USA Today even gave him a National Player of the Year nod. He was just fantastic. He had the second best freshman season probably of any Duke player ever, or at least third. And I would argue, and I'm going to argue, that he actually had the 4th best. But in terms of offensive production, he had the second best, if not the best, scoring freshman season, period. And so he was remarkable. Consensus first team All-American, National Shooting Guard of the Year. RJ Barrett gets looked over time and time again. I could make the argument for him to be higher. I'm sure people will make the argument for him to be lower. He might be a bit polarizing. At 6 is a guy I couldn't put Barrett over because his career accolades and his longevity. 6, I have Grayson Allen. Grayson was 2 shots away from the 2,000-point club. something a lot of people think we'll never get again. If that shot drops against Kansas, all he had to do was hit one shot against Nova and he was in. But, coulda, shoulda, woulda, it never happened. But he's still 12th all time in scoring at Duke. He's top 10 3-pointers made. I actually think he's 5th all time in 3-pointers made. He was first team All ACC as a sophomore, third team All ACC as a senior. A national champion, played a massive role in winning that national championship game, as everybody knows. Grayson Allen stayed 4 years in an era when no one stays 4 years, when you're a projected first-round pick after every season, and that should be applauded as it is. He did regress because of all the hate he was receiving off the court. It was really difficult for Grayson Allen to improve in the way he was supposed to be the National Player of the Year that maybe he was supposed to be, but ultimately still had a just fantastic career. At 5, I have Jahlil Okafor. I talked about how Barrett might have the best offensive season, but where is he in terms of one-and-done freshman seasons? You could really make the argument at anywhere 1 through 4. I wouldn't make 1, but you could really make the argument 2 through 4. And so for me, though, Okafor, even though amongst these 4 players that I'm going to talk about in the one-and-done debate, he averaged the least amount of points of those 4 guys. But Okafor, he was the best player on a national championship team. How many players in Duke basketball history can say that? Well, Leitner, Battier, Shire, Okafor, right? There's really a claim that Okafor could be higher on this list because of that. Best player on a national championship team, a dominant player who I think should have been the National Player of the Year in 2015, I think was shorted that because Kaminsky was a bit more versatile and because Kaminsky was a senior and they rewarded the senior over the freshman in a close National Player of the Year race. Okafor, however, as I mentioned earlier, was the first freshman to ever win ACC Player of the Year. Of course, a consensus first-team All-American as well. He was just such a low post dominant threat that commanded triple and even quadruple teams. He was able to pass out of the post with that kind of just palming the basketball like a grapefruit and slinging it across the court to Quinn or Tyus or whoever was open for 3. He was an absolute game changer. He was the reason, his dominance in the low post was the reason why Duke's guards were able to have the success they had and ultimately win a national title. Okafor could easily be higher on this list, but I went with another one and done right above him at 4. I went Marvin Bagley III. And before I talk about Marvin, I have to note again where that little notebook list where I kind of varied from the original was I actually had Ingram and Tatum swapped originally. I had Ingram higher than Tatum, and I swapped that. But anyway, Bagley's a guy who I had, I think I had Marvin third. I had Marvin third originally on this list. I dropped him to 4, and I'm going to talk about that as I reveal the next 2 guys. But Bagley at 4, if we're talking, counting numbers, overall, Bagley may be the best freshman season ever with like 21 points and 11 rebounds a game. Fantastic ACC Player of the Year, first team All-American. Most seasons would have been a National Player of the Year. That was a really good first team All-American class that year, though. Bagley was just remarkable. And I think what he did, he had one of the best seasons Duke's ever had. And I think it gets brushed over because Zion came the next year. It's kind of like Barrett in that regard. But Bagley to me was more dominant than Barrett by far. And I think that he was a more versatile kind of dominance than Okafor. Neither were very good defenders necessarily, but both were offensive powers in their own right. Bagley less of a back him down kind of big like Okafor, more of a second bounce kind of dunker, put the ball on the floor, move you from the mid-range, hit some threes on you. He was just such a threat from all 3 levels, and that is why I have him over Okafor. He did not contribute to a national title. Now, if his counting numbers were the same as Okafor's, even if I thought Bagley was the better player, Okafor being the best player on the national title would have easily put him over Bagley. But because Bagley's numbers are better, that's why I erred on the side of Marvin at 4 and Okafor at 5. At 3, who I originally had at 2, is Nolan Smith. Nolan Smith, the 2011 ACC Player of the Year, is 18th all-time in scoring at Duke. Nolan, I mean, you can count down the accolades. He's got a lot of them. He was a consensus first-team All-American as well in his senior season, probably third for National Player of the Year. Nolan, a three-time ACC tournament champion, obviously a top three player on a national championship team in 2010, averaging over 17 points a game. Nolan Smith's an absolute legend at Duke. I don't need to explain anything about Nolan, and it is because of his longevity and his status like that I've had him over Bagley, period. And it was also because he has an ACC POI and he has a first-team All-American status that Bagley also had. So Bagley had no claim over Nolan Smith as far as I'm concerned, ever, to me. I was never considering Bagley over Nolan. But in my original draft of this list, I actually had both of those guys over who I have in second. And that is Kyle Singler. I have Kyle Singler second now. And people on Twitter, I posted about this, they convinced me of this. I thought I was kind of crazy, but because at first I was like, maybe Kyle at 2, but then I was like, no, Kyle at 4. And the reason because Kyle at 4, no ACC Player of the Years, never a first-team All-American, actually never a consensus All-American at all in his entire career. I mean, we had guys who had consensus All-American selections at 10. And Kyle never a consensus All-American in 4 years. However, he is a 4-time All-ACC selection. He was All-ACC every year of his career. He was ACC Freshman of the Year. He was first-team All-ACC those back 2 years. But here's where Kyle, he's Final Four most outstanding player as well, which is a massive thing in winning a national title. Here's why Kyle Singler's second. He scored 2,392 career points. That's the fourth most in Duke basketball history. Fourth. We're talking about Leitner, Dawkins, Reddick. Those are the only three players with more points than Kyle Singler. Kyle Singler has over 1,000 career rebounds. He's sixth all-time in rebounding. He's played the most minutes of any Duke basketball player ever. The second most games. He's hit the sixth most threes and the 10th most free throws. And so when you consider the fact that he's at the top of all these lists and at the top of such important lists like points and rebounds, I don't know how Kyle Singler's jersey isn't retired. I guess it's because he had never won a national defensive player of the year, and he doesn't lead in a significant statistical category like Bobby Hurley's the all-time assist leader in Division I college basketball. So he doesn't have anything like that. He doesn't have the criteria that everybody else typically have. But I don't think Jeff Mullins has any of those either. And so to me, it's like, but he's got his jersey retired. So to me, it's like Kyle Singler absolutely should have his jersey retired. No, he was never a consensus All-American, which I think is stupid. I think he should have been at least once, maybe even twice, a consensus second-team All-American. I think he got snubbed majorly because they didn't want to put two Duke players in any given year for some reason. I don't know why. I think that 2010 Duke team was more than good enough to have two consensus All-Americans. But I think the 2011 team was more than good enough to have two consensus All-Americans, but they decided they weren't for some reason. So I think Kyle got shafted in that way, but his counting numbers are just ridiculous. They're out of this world. He's got so much going for him, so many awards. His paragraph of accolades is ridiculously long. And he was all ACC tournament 3 times, as ACC tournament champion 3 times. Kyle Singler, accolades-wise, there's no one who can compete with Kyle Singler. But I test, and there's one guy who has some awards that no one has, and that's the guy at number 1, that's Zion Williamson. Obviously, Zion only an ACC tournament champion, probably should have been a national champion, but ultimately was not, is the only player on this list with significant national player of the year recognition. I talked about the USA Today nod to Barrett, but the only real national player of the year of the decade was Zion Williamson. Dominance unlike we've ever seen. Arguably the best season in Duke basketball history was Zion Williamson's. Now, how I weigh the greatest season potentially individually in Duke history, that's arguable because J.J. Redick's senior year was fantastic, right? And then like Leitner's senior year as well, many other seasons, but certainly in the conversation for best individual season in Duke basketball history. Now, how I weigh that on the final top 100 list against the Leitners, the Reddicks, the Battiers, That's going to be interesting, right? That's going to be interesting because Zion Williamson, in terms of dominance, there probably is no one that can compete with him. But he only played a year, and he never even made the final. He didn't even make the Final Four in that year. So how do you weigh him? For me, because Singler was never a consensus All-American, and he was never even sniffing a National Player of the Year discussion, I could not put him over Zion Williamson. I would have considered Nolan or Marvin. I was more likely to because they were first-team All-Americans and they were their counting stats were higher. But ultimately, I just looked at that and I was like, well, Zion's better. Zion's just better. And you can say because career accolades, he shouldn't be first. He is. He just is. He's just the best player of the 2010s. And there's no simpler way to put it than just Zion Williamson is the 2010s GOAT of Duke basketball. And that's just how it is. He's the best player I've ever seen play at Duke. And I think a lot of people can say that. He was just remarkable, just absolutely remarkable. They were a lost team when he did not play. He should have got the ball even more than he did. The fact that he only shot like 11 or 12 times a game is a crime, honestly. Duke would probably have another national title if he shot 20 times a game. But that's just how it is. Zion Williamson tops this list. That probably doesn't come as a surprise to a lot of people. If you think that I missed the mark on certain ranks, let me know. Leave it in the comments on YouTube or in feedback and comments on Spotify and Apple, or just hit me up on Twitter at Duke_Wisdom. You know where it's at. Make sure to follow that Twitter. Make sure to follow the Instagram. Thank you so much for listening as always. Make sure to subscribe and follow the podcast wherever you're listening. Share the podcast. Let the people know what we're doing out here. Super excited for this. There's another list that's going to come out, I think, either at the end of this week. So you're listening. This is coming out Thursday. So either Friday or early next week, you'll get a pretty cool article that is ranking next year's players. There's a Duke Wisdom Network collaboration. The most collaborators we've ever had for ranking a list. And we've all come together, and I'll average those rankings and let you know how they fell 1 through 15. The middle of these rankings, perhaps the most interesting and diverse kind of ranking system of 4 through like 9. It's getting interesting in there as more ballots come in. So make sure you're on the lookout for that. And if you want to look at the article, if listening to this wasn't enough for you, please go look at the article. Go read the article, the top 25 Duke basketball players of the 2010s. It's on dukewisdom.org. Make sure you go there and read it. Read all the articles. I appreciate it so much. I love seeing the feedback. I love seeing the numbers. I love the discussions that these ranking systems bring. That's why I do them. And my brain works this way. I'm constantly evaluating and ranking things. And so I hope that you guys like this as well. And it's something to do during the off season. Thanks so much for listening and reading, and I'll talk to you guys later.